Welcome to Moonlight Love Chapters. We'd be thrilled if you could subscribe to our channel and leave a comment on this video. Thank you so much for your support. May the power of the werewolf be with you. Alpha and Omega, the Shadow of the Werewolf. Chapter 1. Fleeing from the Darkness. Anais ran. Her footsteps echoed in the empty streets of the small town, but she dared not look back. She knew they were watching her. The wind, cold and sharp, brushed against her face, but nothing could overshadow the fear tormenting her soul. Werewolves. They were closer than she could imagine, and this town was no longer safe. Her ears rang as she hurried through narrow alleyways, every corner seeming like it could be her last. She already knew that if they caught her, there would be no forgiveness. She wasn't ready to die. Not like this, not now. Running was her only choice. Her legs were beginning to give way, her breathing quickened, and her heart pounded so loudly it felt like it could be heard miles away. Anais quickened her pace, barely jumping over cracks in the asphalt, when suddenly something tugged at her arm. She screamed, trying to break free, but she was grabbed more firmly, and someone leapt from the shadow of a dark building straight at her.
A man.
Or maybe a creature. Her eyes were filled with his wild, deadly gaze. He was a werewolf. Anais felt her body tense with terror. This was death, almost inevitable. He walked towards her, his eyes filled with bloodlust. She couldn't run. All that was left was to scream for help, but who would hear her in this dark emptiness? The werewolf sighed and bent over her, preparing to strike the final blow, and she couldn't hold back any longer, desperately shutting her eyes. But at that moment, something broke into their struggle. The shadows crackled, and from the darkness emerged a massive silhouette. Something fast, a wild growl, as though the darkness itself had descended on their world. In the blink of an eye, the werewolf was thrown aside like a toy. Anais gasped, feeling an indescribable dark force enveloping her. She barely glimpsed the silhouette of a large wolf, its amber gaze locking onto hers, and she felt the ground beneath her soften, losing control of herself, disappearing into its shadow. She gasped in fear, her heart hammering in her chest, as if she were part of this nightmare. The wolf, or something more than a wolf, powerful and threatening, carried her into the darkness. Everything happened too fast for her to understand what was going on. She felt only one thing: she had been saved. But salvation did not bring relief. Something inside her resisted. This wolf wasn't an ordinary creature, and it wasn't a friend. It was something much more. When they finally stopped, Anais noticed the mist surrounding her, as if she had entered another world. She tried to break free, but weakness overcame her, and the terrifying sensation overshadowed all thoughts. She met the gaze of the wolf, its amber eyes gleaming in the dark, its breathing deep and heavy. She could feel it assessing her, deciding something. "You're safe, but not for long," a voice whispered in the dark, low and stern in its accent. Anais couldn't understand what the words meant, or why the fact that this mysterious wolf knew more than she did terrified her. But she was already in his power. Chapter 2. Predator's Eyes. Anais awoke from a foggy sleep, feeling her body stiff and aching. The space around her was hazy, like through a mist, but her intuition told her something was wrong. She slowly opened her eyes and saw the ceiling before her, covered in dark velvet. The surfaces were coated with thick moss, and the windows had curtains that barely let in dim rays of light. This wasn't a place she recognized. It was something entirely alien. A headache throbbed, and she tried to sit up, but immediately felt her body weaken. She took a deep breath and froze when she noticed a silhouette nearby. Tall, threatening, standing in the shadows. A man. He stood by the window, his back straight, movements calculated. "Read," Anais didn't know his name, but somehow, deep inside, she knew it. He was the one who had saved her. Her gaze fell on his face. He was handsome, and yet frightening. His dark hair, slightly long, was tied in a messy ponytail that didn't match his sharp, assured movements. His face was just as sharp, his cheekbones stood out, and his jawline was firm, the face of a man accustomed to making decisions. But most striking were his eyes, amber, like a predator's gaze. They were deep, cold, and seemed to see everything, even what was hidden deep inside her soul. He turned toward her. Anais felt her heart tighten. There was no compassion or kindness in his gaze. He was an alpha, and his eyes spoke of power, of control over everything. She could have seen him as an enemy, but everything in her body rejected that thought. "You're safe." His voice was low and stern, with no hint of tenderness. He spoke as if it were an obvious fact. But Anais understood that it wasn't quite so. She didn't feel safe. She was in a house full of shadows and hidden dangers. "Where am I?" she blurted out, her words sounding too loud in the silence. Reed didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, and his presence became heavy, like fog enveloping her consciousness. Every movement was measured, like a predator who knew it was being watched. He approached so close that her breath hitched. "In a place where there will be no more pursuit," he replied, but her eyes skimmed his face. There was a flicker of disdain in his eyes, as if he didn't want anything to do with her. Anais felt a chill run down her spine, but couldn't tear her eyes away from his amber gaze. They seemed endless, deep, and she could feel her instincts waking up, trying to understand him, his essence. It was strange, dangerous, and yet compelling. Reed noticed her focus, and as though sensing her hesitation, took another step closer. His body was large, powerful, his hands tightly folded. He could easily tear her apart if he wished, but he didn't. He just stood and watched her, like a predator in no rush to strike. "Do you think you can control me?" he suddenly asked, his voice not so much a question as a statement. It was as though he knew she was seeking an answer from him, but wasn't in a hurry to give it. She felt a strange sensation rise in her chest, a desire to run, and at the same time, an inexplicable pull. But Anais couldn't understand what this feeling was. Why did she feel that his presence mattered more than anything else in the world? Why couldn't she look away from his powerful gaze? "I don't want to get attached," Reed spoke, his gaze becoming even more guarded. His words were heavy, like a stone, and there was no softness in them. He looked away, but continued to stand right in front of her. "You need to understand. Here, you are not safe, even if I saved you. This is not our territory." Anais felt something stir within her, as if his words had awakened hidden fears. But there was something more than just fear. It was a sense that she couldn't be alone, that she needed to be close to him. And at the same time, a fear that this connection with him might lead to catastrophe. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze. She couldn't quite figure out what she wanted to know, but she knew that Reed wasn't just an alpha. He was something more. And she had to understand what this pain in her heart meant when she looked at him. Chapter 3: Dangerous Proximity. Anais increasingly found herself thinking that something had changed. She couldn't explain why, but Reed seemed to be avoiding her. He was always nearby, but never gave her the closeness she had expected. His presence was palpable, always there, but never too close. It was as though he was building an invisible wall between them, one that kept her from getting closer. Despite his silent behavior, his eyes always found her in the crowd. His gaze was sharp, sometimes cold, but occasionally his eyes lingered on her longer than they should have. She felt it, even if she couldn't fully understand what those silent moments meant. It wasn't malice. It was something else, like Reed couldn't rid himself of something pulling him toward her. And though he tried to hide his emotions, Anais could feel his instincts battling his mind, holding back something deep inside that was trying to break free. Every time she tried to get closer, his shoulders tensed, and he became even more alert. His behavior left a strange unease in her heart. The more she tried to understand him, the more complicated he became. He wasn't just an alpha. There was something about him that both terrified and attracted her at the same time. Today was different. She felt something was about to happen and decided to take matters into her own hands. Anais slowly approached Reed, who was standing by the large table, looking over maps, as usual, lost in his thoughts. She noticed he tensed slightly when he heard her steps, but didn't turn around. She sighed, deciding to make the first move. "Reed." Her voice was soft but confident. He didn't respond, but she noticed how his shoulders subtly stiffened. It was the only answer she received. Anais moved closer. He seemed not to notice her, but she could feel his presence, like a powerful, sticky energy that made her heart beat faster. She stood beside him, feeling his scent fill her nose, mingling with the smell of the forest and the cool night air. His scent was unusual, a mix of woodiness and something primal, ancient. He was like a wolf, strong and unseen, as dangerous as he was alluring. Her hand brushed his elbow, just for a moment. And in that instant, when their bodies touched, it felt as though all the energy around them compressed into one point. Anais felt an electric charge run through her skin, coursing through her entirely. It was more than just physical contact. It felt as though the world had slowed, and the only thing that mattered was her and Reed. She didn't pull her hand away in time and felt her heart miss a beat. That moment was as long and dangerous as an encounter with a predator. His hand twitched, and she felt his fingers clench into a fist. He exhaled sharply, his eyes, bright and cold, locked with hers. There was fire in them, burning and hidden, yet also cold and controlled. "You don't understand." His voice was rough, almost low, as if he had just woken from a deep sleep. He stood before her, motionless, but she could feel the tension building inside him. "You shouldn't be this close to me." Anais felt her body, despite the fear, unconsciously pulling her toward him. Everything inside her tensed, as if her instincts were responding to his words, but couldn't stop her actions. She felt her breathing quicken, and her thoughts became tangled. "Why?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. This was the moment when she had to realize that their connection wasn't just a coincidence. And not just because she was drawn to him, but because Reed couldn't allow himself to be with her. He was too strong, too dangerous. He leaned forward, his face so close that she could feel his heat. His breath brushed her skin, and it was like an electric jolt that quickened her heart. "Because I can't be with you. I can't allow myself to do that." "You're too," his voice cut off, and he pulled back again, as if something inside him had tightened, not allowing him to continue. Anais felt her chest tighten with pain. It felt like a deception, like something she couldn't understand. But Reed had already turned, not giving her the chance to respond. Still, her body knew that this connection between them was only just beginning. She stood there, feeling her heart still racing for a few moments, as if trying to remember that instant. The moment when they were on the edge. Chapter 4. The Dream of the Wolf. At night, Anais tossed and turned in bed, unable to fall asleep. Thoughts of Reed, of that strange and unspoken tension between them, kept her awake. She felt that changes were happening within her, that her world was shifting, and with it, her perception of Reed. Sometimes she felt trapped, as if that trap was made of her own desires. But there was nothing she could do about it. Finally, when she fell into sleep, her body relaxed, and her thoughts became chaotic. Everything felt strange and unfamiliar, like being in another world. In this dream, Everything was dark and mysterious, the forest vast and impassable, as if pulling her into its embrace. Anais walked on soft earth, feeling her steps absorbed by the grass, the air growing cold and damp. The branches of trees intertwined, creating strange patterns in the air. She felt something move in the darkness, watching her from behind the trees. It was huge and quiet, almost invisible. But her instincts told her it wasn't just an animal. It was something more. She stopped, looking around, and at that moment, a wolf appeared before her. But this wasn't just any wolf. Its eyes were amber, glowing like two flickering lights in the night. It approached her without a sound, and she felt her heart race wildly in her chest. It was beautiful, yet terrifying. Its fur was dark, almost black, and she felt its gaze penetrate the deepest parts of her soul. The wolf stood before her, inhaling her scent, its body tense but not threatening. It wasn't just a beast. It was part of something larger, something ancient and magical. Anais felt its presence envelop her. Its eyes were full of mystery, as though it knew her secrets, her most intimate desires. She couldn't tear her gaze away from its eyes, feeling as if it was searching for something in her that she hadn't yet found. She wanted to say something but couldn't. The wind stirred her hair, and her body was overwhelmed by a strange feeling, as if she was bound to this wolf by something more important than she could understand. Suddenly, she felt its breath touch her skin, and her heart stopped. Everything around her quieted, and in that moment, she understood that the wolf could take her with it. And she couldn't resist. But before she could take a step, the wolf let out a low, almost audible growl and stepped back. Anais took a step toward it, but everything around her disappeared, and she woke up. She awoke in her room, but the feeling of the dream lingered. It felt as though the world she had just been in was real, and what was around her now was nothing but an illusion. Anais sat up in bed, confused by what was happening. Her chest rose heavily with deep breaths, as if she had just run through the forest. She looked around, trying to return to reality, but her gaze stopped at the door. It was slightly open, and Reed stood in the doorway. His figure seemed dark in the half-light, his amber eyes glowing in the darkness. Anais froze, unable to move, unable to speak. Reed didn't say a word, but his gaze was deep and penetrating. Anais felt as if he was studying her carefully, as though he knew everything that had been going on in her mind, all her thoughts and feelings. His presence was more than physical. It was penetrating her soul, making her feel as though her inner world was opening up to him. "You saw him too?" Reed asked, and his voice carried no surprise or judgment, only a slight tension. It was a question that had arisen on its own, as an answer to what had happened. He knew. Anais couldn't respond right away. All she could do was look at him, searching his eyes for even the smallest trace of doubt. But there was none. Reed looked at her like a wolf who had known all along that his prey was in his claws. "You saw him in the dream, didn't you?" he continued, and his words sounded less like a question and more like a statement. All this time, while she had been in his house, he had been watching her, and it seemed he knew more than she could have imagined. Anais felt her heart racing again, her body frozen in fear and desire. This wasn't just a dream. It was something much bigger. And this moment, when Reed stood in the doorway, as part of her dream, only confirmed that everything between them wasn't a coincidence. "You have to explain everything to me," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. Reed hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, his step soft and assured. He wasn't just a man. He wasn't just an alpha. He was part of what was happening to her, and she couldn't ignore it. "We need to talk, Anais," he said, his voice deep and foggy, like the night itself. "But now isn't the time." And with those words, he left, leaving her alone, but with the feeling that he would be back in her life, in that world she couldn't comprehend. Chapter 5. The Shapeshifter Killer. The city was consumed by silence, broken only by the occasional footsteps of passers-by and the rustling of leaves beneath their feet. But for Anais, this silence felt false. The anxious fire within her soul never died out, a sense of impending danger growing clearer with each passing day. She couldn't explain exactly what was troubling her, but her intuition told her something terrifying was already close. The very shapeshifter that brought death to the city. Anais felt its presence like cold breath, like a shadow creeping out of the dark. She didn't know where it had come from or what it wanted, but one thing was clear: it was dangerous. This shapeshifter killed, and its traces went unnoticed, like a ghost disappearing in the blink of an eye. Every morning, when she left the house, her gaze would automatically sweep the streets, expecting to see something that would betray it, someone who was no longer human. It could be hiding among the crowd, invisible to everyone, but she felt its energy disturbing the balance. It seemed as though the whole city knew of its presence, but no one dared to speak of it aloud. Reed had started keeping Anais under surveillance. He didn't speak of it directly, but her place in the house became permanent, as if she were his responsibility. She didn't know what was going on in his mind, but she felt him gradually pulling away, though still remaining close. Every glance was filled with silent questions and uncertainty. He tried to be near, but always kept his distance. Anais noticed that Reed began to avoid her whenever she tried to talk about her worries. He wasn't ready to open up. It was obvious. His eyes, always so confident and impenetrable, were now filled with internal demons. He didn't allow himself to show vulnerability, but for some reason, her presence stirred him, just as his did for her. Each day, it became harder for Anais to stay in the house, which was increasingly feeling like a cage. Reed acted as though he didn't notice, but every glance he cast was focused, as though he were searching her eyes for a signal, something that would tell him what to do. One night, while Anais was sitting on the balcony, trying to gather the strength to deal with the overwhelming emotions, Reed approached from behind. He was quieter than usual, like a shadow gliding over the ground. Anais turned and met his gaze. It was as deep and penetrating as always, but there was fear hidden in it. She immediately understood he was afraid. "Do you feel it?" Reed asked, his voice barely audible. "It's close. I can't let you be out there alone." Anais looked at him in surprise, trying to understand what he meant. Reed didn't say that he felt the same fear, but his words were full of shadow. He knew the shapeshifter was near, and its presence made Reed clench his fists in unease, his instincts on the verge of breaking. "You shouldn't be following me," Anais replied, but her voice trembled. She couldn't hide what she was feeling, and her words weren't confident. Every day, it became harder for her to fight this inner unease. Reed looked at her. His face remained calm, but a storm raged inside his mind. He couldn't allow Anais to be in danger, but he couldn't understand why her safety had become so important to him. He was the alpha used to protecting his pack, but with her, everything was different. She was something more than just a member of his group. "You won't stay here alone anyway," he said decisively. "We'll track this shapeshifter together." Anais felt his words sink into her soul. She couldn't understand what was happening between them, but she felt that for Reed, this struggle was not only for her safety. He was holding back his feelings, like one would hold back a beast tormented by hunger. And though he didn't allow himself to open up, Anais knew they were both on the brink of breaking. Reed left, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The streets were empty, and only the shadow of the shapeshifter, like a cold specter, followed Anais's every step. She didn't yet know that this was just the beginning, and what awaited her could become the scariest trial of her life. Chapter 6. The First Kiss. Twilight had already descended upon the forest, and with each step Anais and Reed took among the trees, the darkness thickened. They were in the heart of the events, their eyes adjusting to the night light, but the surrounding silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves, felt tense. The forest was breathing, and they breathed with it. Reed walked ahead, his steps confident and calm, but within him was a hidden, tense instinct that kept him alert. Anais walked a little behind, her thoughts wandering between the emotions that lingered from their shared days. Everything around them was calm, but within her, a rising anxiety grew, one she couldn't explain. The sounds of the forest were so real, so foreign to her perception. Every tree, every step marked their presence. And in this world, full of hidden threats, she was with Reed, feeling his protection, but at the same time, his invisible distance. As they passed through some underbrush, Anais suddenly tripped over a tree root. Losing her balance, she nearly fell, but Reed was next to her in an instant. His strong arms caught her, pulling her close, and she instinctively touched his chest to regain her balance. This movement brought their bodies incredibly close. The moment stretched, and Anais felt the warmth of his body, his tension. She looked into his eyes, amber like fire, bright and intense. Reed stood still, his breath a little quicker. He was so close that Anais could smell him, that primal, animal scent that carried power and authority. His gaze was frozen, but filled with something deeper than just concern for her safety. He didn't pull away immediately, his hand still on her waist, and her hand slightly touched his chest. It was like a moment between two worlds, when their hearts merged into one, but the realization that it could be dangerous, like an echo of days past, kept them from moving forward. Anais noticed how he slightly lifted his head, almost instinctively, and a faint shadow of a smile appeared on his lips, disappearing as quickly as it came. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. His voice was low, hoarse. But he stopped, as though he didn't know what to say next. He was holding himself back, holding back all the instincts that were now breaking free. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice almost commanding, but with more concern than he'd like to admit. Anais, feeling the tension in the air grow stronger, quickly pulled away from him, trying to restore some distance. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She couldn't understand what had just happened. Why had this inexplicable attraction suddenly emerged between them, as if an invisible force bound them on a deeper level? She looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no longer the sharp, cold detachment she was used to seeing. Now there was a struggle, an inner tension as strong as the instincts that flooded her own body. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, with a suppressed tone. "I shouldn't have." Anais felt her face flush. She stepped back, trying to regain her composure, but her voice was tense, as though she had no words for explanation. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, unable to withstand the silence. "We can't just—" But her voice faltered, and she fell silent. What she had just experienced wasn't something simple that she could explain. Reed stepped back again, his expression changing, becoming colder and more distant. His eyes now hid everything he had been trying to conceal, and the tension between them became as thick as the night air. "You're right," he said quietly, but there was neither condemnation nor regret in his words. It seemed like he was trying to put an invisible barrier between them that neither of them could cross. And despite those words, Anais still felt his presence nearby, like an unseen threat and, at the same time, salvation. That kiss, accidental and unwanted, left a mark on her soul, and now she couldn't forget what had happened, no matter how hard she tried. Chapter 7. You Are My Weakness. Reed sat atop the hill, gazing at the dark strip of the horizon where the night sky blended smoothly into the deep abyss of the forest. He felt confused and vulnerable, which was completely unacceptable for an alpha. He had always kept his emotions in check, but after that kiss with Anais, everything had changed. He tried to convince himself that it was just a mistake, a moment of weakness, that none of it mattered. But something in her eyes, in her touch, wouldn't let him rest. He was strong. He was a leader. But next to her, he felt weak. And that angered him. There was something in the way she looked at him that triggered a panic inside him, as if she could see all his hidden corners, his darkest fears. She was too close. Don't think about her, he forced himself to think. But the harder he tried to push her image away, the clearer she appeared in his mind. And the more he avoided her, the more he felt that burning attraction toward her. Anais seemed unaware of how deeply she affected him. She was just there, like life itself, real, with its struggles and joys, like an untamable force. She wasn't submissive to him, like the others, and that felt like a knife to his heart. It both attracted and frightened him. That evening, when he saw one of the werewolves, Alex, approaching Anais in the camp, something inside him snapped. He couldn't understand why it bothered him so much. Alex was one of the newer pack members, and like everyone else, he was expected to respect Reed's personal space. But it was in that moment, when Alex, smirking, started a conversation with Anais, that it stirred up a storm of emotions in him. He saw Anais awkwardly look away, her arms crossed over her chest as she tried to hide her discomfort. And something in her movements awakened his jealousy. Alex wasn't just crossing boundaries, he was shamelessly flirting with her. That was too much for Reed. Without saying a word, without any intention, he stood up and walked toward them. He knew it was foolish, but he couldn't stop. When he got closer, Alex was already close enough to sense Reed's approach. He looked at the alpha with a hint of disdain, as if unaware of who he was dealing with. "Don't you know your place, Alex?" Reed spoke in a cold voice, with an icy undertone of threat. He stepped even closer, his figure towering over the slender werewolf. Alex slowly lifted his gaze, his face tightening. He hadn't expected Reed to say openly what others only thought. "Can't you see she's not yours?" Alex said, stepping aside. "She's a free woman. She doesn't need anyone to protect her." Reed felt his body tense, his instincts immediately going on high alert. He clenched his fists, but couldn't allow himself to strike. All he needed to do was assert his dominance. "She's under my protection." Reed's voice rang loud and firm, like an order that couldn't be ignored. "And if you try to get closer to her again, I won't hold back." Anais froze, unsure of what to do. Everything was happening so fast that she couldn't process the situation. She didn't understand why Reed had reacted so aggressively. Alex fell silent, his face twisting in dissatisfaction, but he didn't dare argue. He understood that the alpha was within his rights. Reed looked at him one more time, then turned to Anais and, without saying a word, walked toward her tent. He knew her gaze would be full of questions, but he wasn't ready to answer. He didn't know why these feelings consumed him so fiercely. Why did he care so much about every glance she received from others? When Anais approached him a little later, he was already sitting by the fire, his gaze focused on the flames as if he was trying to find answers in their dance. "You don't have to protect me," she said quietly when she sat beside him. She was trying to understand his behavior, her voice calm but uncertainty hidden in her eyes. Reed sighed, leaning his head back, and replied, "You don't understand, Anais. You are my weakness, and I can't hide it anymore." Her heart stopped. Reed didn't often open up, and every word he said felt like a heavy burden settling on her shoulders. "You're not a weakness," she said, almost in a whisper, but there was sincerity in her voice, and that made Reed relax a little. "But you can allow yourself to be human." For a moment, their eyes met, And that was when something changed. Reed didn't know where his desire to protect her would lead, but now he was certain that this woman had become a part of his life. And perhaps part of his destiny. Chapter 8. The Bond. Anais woke that night with a strange feeling, as if someone was watching her. In the dark room, her gaze immediately fell on Reed, who was sitting by the window, his eyes reflecting the moonlight, as if they themselves were part of the night. He didn't notice. She had woken up, lost in his thoughts. Anais had long felt that there was something between them that went beyond just tense chemistry. She could feel how his presence affected her. It wasn't just physical attraction, but something deeper and darker. She couldn't understand why her heart raced in his presence, and why her thoughts kept returning to him over and over again. She knew her feelings for him weren't random. All these strange sensations, her attachment, her intuition that she wasn't here by chance, all of it somehow tied to him. That night, as she lay in the shadows, trying to find answers to her questions, she felt something dark and ancient creep into her mind. "You feel it too, don't you?" Her voice was weak, barely audible. She didn't know where the words had come from, but she felt their truth. She looked around the room, searching for something that could explain this feeling. Reed was silent, but his shoulders tensed. He could feel her eyes fixed on him, her breath becoming shallow. It was as if an invisible force was slowly binding them together. He tried to fight it, to ignore that it wasn't a coincidence, but inside, a question burned. How long could he hide his weakness? When he turned to her, his eyes reflected not only the moonlight, but also doubt and fear. He knew that what was happening between them had no logical explanation. "You speak the truth." His voice was low and hoarse, as if he was trying to say something he wasn't ready to understand himself. "There's something between us, but I can't allow myself to accept it." Anais couldn't hide her confusion. She got out of bed and approached him, but everything in her body screamed of fear. She didn't understand why he was closing himself off. They both felt that magical bond tying them together, but his resistance was evident. "Why are you resisting so much?" She couldn't stay silent any longer, her words bursting out like water from a dam. "Why can't you just admit that this is between us?" Reed stood up, his figure becoming even more imposing in the dim light. He took a step toward her, his hands almost reaching her shoulders, but he stopped them, desperately fighting with himself. "You don't understand, Anais." His voice was almost a growl, like a beast trying to keep its animal nature in check. "If I accept you as mine, you'll become part of my pack forever. You won't just be a woman. You'll be part of this world, a world that doesn't allow weakness. It's dangerous. You don't know what you're getting into." Her eyes filled with understanding and worry. Anais couldn't hide her pain at those words. She felt how hard this was for him, but at the same time, she felt how this connection between them was pulling her toward him, as if her destiny had already been decided. "But I am already part of this world, Reed." Her words were quiet but firm. "And if you want to protect me, you have to accept it. You can't fight what you're feeling. This isn't just magic, it's something more." Reed was about to respond, but then something changed. In Anais' eyes, something unusual gleamed. Her body seemed to vibrate with the power hidden deep within her. Reed felt a chill run down his spine. His heart raced faster. "You don't understand," he whispered. "If I open up to you, this won't just be some random connection. I will become part of your life, and you will become part of mine. You'll be in danger from everything around us." Anais took a step forward, her breath calm, but her gaze resolute. She knew the risk, but her feelings were stronger than her fear. "I'm ready," she said, and those words unsettled Reed. "I'm ready to be a part of this. You're not the only one who's afraid, but perhaps if we accept this together, we can handle it." He froze, his eyes burning, but the inner conflict didn't disappear. Everything in him screamed to push her away to protect her, but his heart couldn't let her go. Without a word, he reached out to her face, gently touching her cheek. In his touch, there was not only strength, but also a deep tenderness he had kept hidden from himself. "You don't know what you're getting into, Anais," he finally said, but his words were not so much a warning as a confession that he himself had long been unable to free himself from this bond. Chapter 9. I Can't Be Without You. Anais stood at the edge of the forest. Her feet felt the earth, but her mind was far away. Everything inside her screamed that she could no longer stay here, in this world full of danger and secrets. But her heart was heavy with pain. Reed was the one who had tied her to this world, the one who had become her anchor, and the one she had to leave for his own safety. It was her decision, and despite feeling his presence, hearing his voice constantly in her ears, she knew she had to go. She glanced around, her eyes sweeping over the dark trees. The forest that had been her home had become a place of fear. It was where she had met Reed, but now it was a place she had to leave. She couldn't be with him because she was the one who would bring ruin to his pack. And if her feelings grew too strong, if their bond took over, everything would be destroyed. Clenching her fists, Anais took a step forward. She was leaving. She could no longer be part of this world, could not be the cause of its destruction. But as soon as she took that step, her heart fluttered and a sharp pain pierced her chest. It wasn't a physical sensation, it was something inside, like his hands, his will, his strength, tearing out of her and pulling after her. Reed. There was something in her body more than just magic. It was a connection she couldn't break, even if she tried. The pain grew, and each breath became harder. She felt her body responding to this call, her mind clouded by the fog of pain and rupture. Her legs gave way, and she fell to the ground, gasping for air. Just when she thought she couldn't stand anymore, she heard the rustle of the wind. It couldn't be him. He was far away, but still, she felt his approach. It was more than just his scent in the air. It was his pain, his yearning. Anais stood up, her eyes closed, and her heart pounded in her chest like mad. She couldn't explain why her mind was fighting this, but her instincts were pulling her back to him. She couldn't leave. She couldn't leave him in this pain. Reed was near. He was near because he couldn't bear the rupture. With each passing second, with every step, his pain became unbearable. He knew she had left, her footsteps taking her away from him, but each meter between them was like a long scream, cutting into his soul. Reed knew that despite his cruelty and strength, he was powerless to stop the bond that connected them. He could barely breathe as he climbed the hill, his eyes filled with despair. He couldn't let her go. He knew he should, but he couldn't. His strength no longer helped. It couldn't save him from this pain. Finally, his gaze met hers. She stood at the edge of the world, her figure barely distinguishable in the dark, but her eyes were glowing. Anais, his voice was weak, restrained, as if he feared this was just her final step, her final goodbye. "You can't leave." She looked at him, and in her gaze was something that made his heart nearly stop. She understood he couldn't let her go, but she also understood their connection was dangerous. And yet, she couldn't leave him alone in this world. "I have to go, Reed. I can't be with you. I can't be part of your world. It's too dangerous for all of us." He stepped forward, and her words couldn't stop him. He was close now, so close she could feel his breath, his warmth. "You don't understand." His voice was low and desperate. "You're already part of this world, Anais. And you'll be part of me. You can't just leave. It's not your choice." Her eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling from the intensity of the pain she felt for him. Everything in her being was filled with both love and fear. She couldn't understand why she couldn't break this bond, but she also couldn't leave. Reed stepped closer, his hand reaching for her face, and she, trembling, allowed him to touch her. The gesture was so warm and deep that Anais felt her heart begin to heal. He was near, and now she knew she couldn't leave him. "I can't be without you, Anais." His words were soft, but full of fear and recognition. "You are everything to me. You are my weakness, my strength, my salvation. I won't let you go." Her heart melted at his words, and she couldn't fight what she was feeling anymore. She moved toward him, inhaling the scent of his skin, feeling his presence like never before. And in that moment, she knew that despite all the fears and dangers, she couldn't be without him. "Then don't let me go," she whispered, and their lips met in a kiss full of pain, love, and promise. Chapter 10. The Flame of the Night. The dark night hid them from the world, surrounded by trees, thick and tall, like guardians of the forest. Silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional sound of nocturnal creatures. But for Anais and Reed, this silence was something else, anticipation. It was as if nature itself had paused, giving them a chance. And they knew this was the moment when everything was about to change. They both stood in the center of a small clearing where a fire warmed the night, igniting the dark shadows dancing in the tree crowns. Anais felt his gaze penetrate her soul, and with each glance, its weight became clearer. He was near, too close, his breath quickening, his body tense with power he couldn't hide. "This can't go on," she thought, though deep down she knew she couldn't stop. What was happening between them was much stronger than either of them could control. She felt it in every movement, in every exchanged glance. There was a powerful, inexpressible force between them that they couldn't ignore. A force like a flame, crawling deep inside their souls, giving them no chance to turn back. Anais, his voice was raspy, as if the darkness around him had consumed him. He took a step forward, and she instinctively stepped back, but could not move far. He was her trap, and she knew it, and she didn't want to leave it. "Reed, I can't." Her voice was soft, full of inner struggle. She knew she had to let him go, that it would be safer for everyone. But what was happening went against everything she had ever thought was right. "You can't, because I won't let you," he replied, and his eyes, filled with determination and pain, no longer hid the passion burning in his chest. He stepped even closer, and her heart raced faster. In his eyes was not just strength, there was purpose, a need for her presence, for her soul. He couldn't leave her, and she couldn't leave him. At some point, her own desires became too obvious, too strong to continue resisting. Reed approached her so closely that she could feel the warmth of his body. She froze, not even trying to pull away. It had been decided long ago. They both knew it. In his eyes burned a spark, something inhuman, something wild, irresistibly real. "You're mine," he whispered, his breath coming fast, like on the verge of something incredible. His hands rose to her face, and she, despite losing the last bit of control, allowed herself to relax in his arms. She felt the tension melt away, all her anger and worry dissolving in his touch. In that moment, her heart was no longer divided. She felt that part of her belonged to him. And in his eyes, she saw that his part was with her too. Reed leaned in, and his lips finally met hers. It wasn't just a touch, it was the merging of their souls, their beings. They exchanged all their doubts, passions, fears, and desires in one kiss. Anais felt her body respond to every touch, how her insides ignited in reply. She knew this wasn't just love, it was a fire they both couldn't extinguish. His hands slid down her shoulders, pulling her closer. The fire grew, filling their chests, growing brighter with each passing moment. And in that moment, she understood that she couldn't be without him. She couldn't live in a world where he wasn't by her side. "I will protect you." His words were firm, and Anais felt every sound of his voice sear into her heart. "You're mine now, and I swear I'll do everything so no one can take you from me. This is my vow." Her breath became heavy as she felt the power of these words. He was right, she was his, and he was hers. And it wasn't just a promise, it was fate, binding them for eternity. "You are my flame, Anais," he whispered, holding her close, and Anais felt her body burn from his words, from his touch. This wasn't just passion. It was their fiery union, their power unstoppable. The night continued to consume them, and the only light in this darkness was the fire burning between them. The flame they had ignited with their feelings, their unity. And they knew this was just the beginning. Chapter 11. The Curse of Love. Anais stood by the window, gazing into the misty distance, where night had already spread its dark wings over the world. Fear and determination reflected in her eyes, entwined in an unbearable web. She knew that her power, something she could not control, something that had always been a part of her, had become a threat to Reed. The more she thought about it, the more she realized, if she stayed near him, she would kill him. This curse of love was an unbearably heavy burden, and she couldn't allow herself to be the cause of his death. Reed stood behind her, his heavy breathing audible in the silence. He couldn't help but notice how her posture had changed, how her shoulders had slumped, how her hands pressed to her chest as if shielding her pain. "Have you decided to leave?" His voice was quiet, but there was such certainty in it, as if he already knew the answer before she spoke. Anais didn't answer right away. She kept looking out the window, unable to meet his gaze. She understood that his words would be hard for her, that every moment here with him would tear her heart apart. But she couldn't be his doom, and she couldn't be the cause of his pain. He was too important to her to put him in such danger. "I have to leave." Her voice trembled, but she still said it resolutely. "You don't understand. My power. It could destroy you, Reed. I can't allow myself to be your death." She turned to face him, and her eyes met his, but she saw not doubt, but certainty in them. He didn't back down, didn't hesitate. Everything about him was focused on her, and it tore her soul even more. "You can't leave," he said quietly, but it sounded less like a request and more like a command. He stepped forward, his gaze becoming more intense, as if he wanted to pierce her soul. "You're already mine, and I've already accepted you as mine. No matter what happens to us, no matter what your power is, you'll be here because I'll be here with you." Anais felt his words breaking through her walls. She wanted to retreat, wanted to step back, but his presence was so strong that she couldn't resist. His hands, filled with determination, touched her shoulder, and she froze. It was more than a touch, it was a promise that they would be together, no matter what. "You can't let me go," he continued, his voice becoming more insistent, "because I won't let you go. I know there's danger between us. I know your power could kill me. But I'm not afraid of that. You're not a curse to me. You're my salvation." His words seemed to break the barrier in her heart. She felt his heavy gaze penetrate her soul, his words echoing in her mind despite her fear. He wasn't afraid of her power. He wasn't afraid of what she could do. He wanted to be with her no matter what. It was more than love. It was acceptance, full and unconditional. "But you don't understand," she whispered, her voice nearly inaudible. "I could kill you. I don't want that to happen. I can't live like this, knowing you could die because of me." Reed moved closer to her, his hands gently wrapped around her waist, and she felt his warmth, his strength. His presence filled her completely, as if he was not just a man, but part of her essence. He was part of her world, and she couldn't walk away from him. But still, her fear was stronger. "You don't understand, Anais," he said, his voice now soft but firm. "I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid of losing you. You're my everything. And I'll protect you no matter what comes. My life has no meaning if you're not by my side. I'll accept you as you are, with all your power, with every curse of yours. Because you're mine." Her heart raced, and she realized that she couldn't fight herself anymore. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't be without him. And although her power was dangerous, her love for him was stronger. She was ready to be by his side, despite the risk. "You shouldn't say that," she whispered, her voice growing softer. "You don't understand what I could do to you." "I understand," he replied, gently stroking her hair. "But I also know that I can't live without you. If even my death is the price for you, I'll accept it, because I can't let you go." Her heart broke at those words. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't abandon him. He was her salvation, despite all the danger, despite her curse. And she too was ready to fight for them both, even if it meant confronting the dark side of her power. "You're my weakness, Reed," she whispered, lifting her head and meeting his gaze. "But you're also my strength, and I will be with you, always." Her words were the final decision. She accepted her fate, accepted her love, and, despite everything that could happen, they were ready to face it together. Chapter 12. The Final Battle. The forest was cloaked in shadow, and the stars seemed to hide behind a thick cloud. The air was thick with the scent of blood and tension. Anais stood next to Reed, her heart beating fast, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where tiny lights flickered, glowing figures of cultists who were closing in on their territory. In their eyes burned something dark, sinister, and she knew that this night wouldn't be just another trial for their pack. This was their final battle. "We can't let them take you," Reed said, his voice low and tense. He looked at her with an expression that made Anais feel her chest tighten with pain. He was ready to fight, ready to battle until the end to protect her. But in that moment, she understood that it might cost him his life. "I don't want to lose you," she quietly replied, her hands instinctively sliding over his shoulders as if trying to transfer her strength to him. "But if you die, what will be left of me?" Reed placed his palm on her face, his touch soft, but in it was a resolve that could break any barrier. "We're in this together, and in this battle, we'll fight until the end. But you have to be ready. If I fall, you'll have to carry on. Don't give up." And at that moment, when he spoke with such certainty, Anais felt a storm begin inside her. The dark magic, hidden for centuries, was awakening within her, like an ancient beast ready to break free. She had never been able to fully control her power, but now it was necessary. She had to protect him. She had to save them. Reed took her hand, and in that moment, she felt his strength merge with hers, like they became one. It wasn't just a merging of bodies and souls. It was their true bond, unseen, but unbreakable. Suddenly, the forest was filled with a loud roar. The cultists attacked. Dark figures in black cloaks leapt from the shadows, creating unimaginable chaos. Anais felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. This wasn't just an attack. This was something bigger. The cultists had come not only for her, but for her power, for her magic, for her curse. "We have to stick together," Reed said, his gaze becoming more determined despite the surroundings. "Are you ready?" Anais nodded, unable to speak. She was ready, ready to fight, ready to become a weapon in the hands of fate. But, despite all her desire to protect him, she knew that her power was far more dangerous. It could kill them both. In the blink of an eye, the cultists attacked. First, with a loud scream, several of them rushed toward Reed, but he easily fended them off, his claws slashing through the air, leaving streaks of blood on the ground. Anais stood nearby, her eyes closed, her body feeling the power growing stronger with every passing second. But suddenly, one of the cultists, huge and withered, moved toward her at inhuman speed. He was armed with some ancient artifact, glowing with a dim green light. Anais tried to deflect his attack with magic, but it was too powerful. He was trying to bind her power, not letting it fully awaken. Reed surged toward her, but in that moment, one of the cultists managed to strike him with a heavy blow. His sword plunged into his chest, and Reed fell to the ground, his body twisting in agony. "Reed!" Her voice broke, and at that moment, like never before, Anais felt her power explode within her. It was like awakening something ancient and powerful that had slept inside her all these years. "Reed!" Her hands stretched forward, and at that moment, she felt her magic, the magic that was part of her, unfurl like the massive wings of a dark angel. Her eyes lit up with a bright glow, and she unleashed the full force of the darkness. Everything in her body came alive, her eyes turning bright green, like flames devouring everything in its path. And in that moment, as she raised her arms to the sky, her magic broke free. It was an explosion so powerful that the ground beneath her shook. Magic erupted from her body like a storm, instantly destroying everything in its way. Light and darkness twisted in the air, and Anais felt her magic consume the cultists, wiping them from the earth. They couldn't stand against her power. She was omnipotent. She was destruction and rebirth. She was justice. When the fog cleared and silence returned, Anais stood among the remnants of the battle. Her breath was heavy, and her gaze was fixed on Reed, who was still lying on the ground. She ran to him, feeling his blood dripping onto her hands. "Are you all right?" Her voice was full of fear, and she gently touched his shoulder. Reed opened his eyes and looked at her, his gaze full of pain, but also something else, gratitude. He couldn't speak, but his hand tightly gripped hers, and in his eyes was everything: love, attachment, and acceptance. "You saved us," he whispered, his voice weak, but full of strength. Anais pulled him close, understanding that everything had changed now. She was no longer the one who feared her power. She was the one who protects, and she was ready to fight for them both until her last breath. Chapter 13. Love Stronger Than Fate. The light of dawn gently filtered through the window, painting the room in soft golden hues. Anais sat beside Reed, her fingers gently squeezing his hand, feeling each beat of his heart. She couldn't help but notice how his breathing had become steady, and his muscles were slowly relaxing. He was alive, and that was the most important thing. Just recently, she had thought she would lose him. He had been on the brink of death, his wounds so severe that she feared she wouldn't make it in time to save him. But her power, she hadn't known it could be so strong. And though she had paid a heavy price for it, in her eyes, there was only gratitude and relief that Reed was still here. She continued to gaze at him, unable to look away. His face remained pale, but there was still strength in it, the kind that had always drawn her in, the kind that made her heart beat faster. He opened his eyes, and their amber gaze met. In his eyes was so much warmth, so many emotions, that Anais froze for a moment. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice gentle and full of concern. Reed gave a slight smile, his hand squeezing her fingers, and the faintest trace of pain appeared on his lips, but there was also an acknowledgement. He tried to sit up, but her insistent gaze stopped him. "You need to give me some time," he said quietly, but his voice was already strong and firm. "I couldn't bear it if you weren't here." Anais felt her heart tighten at these words. He was the one who had always been ready to fight, ready to protect his pack, but at that moment, she understood how vulnerable he was, how important she was to him. This wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, an unconscious but powerful bond that connected them. Reed looked at her again, his gaze filled with something more than just gratitude. It was an acknowledgement that penetrated deep into her soul. "I knew you were mine," he said, his voice low, filled with strength and emotions he might have kept hidden for a long time. "Even when I first smelled your scent. Everything that came before this was just preparation for us to meet. I couldn't explain it then, but you became a part of me, Anais." Anais felt her chest fill with warmth from these words. He knew. He had always known. And all this time, she had tried to resist, trying to push away her feelings, hiding from the power that threatened their world. But he was right. They were connected much deeper than she had imagined. "Then why did you wait so long?" Her voice was quiet, but there was a mix of surprise and pain in it. Why hadn't he told her this before? Why hadn't he told her she was already a part of his life before they even met face to face? Reed propped himself up on his elbows, his eyes meeting hers again. In his gaze was only a sincere answer, full of acknowledgement. "Because I was afraid. Afraid you might turn away from me, from this. You're too strong, Anais. And I wasn't sure I was ready to be a part of your strength. I didn't want it to destroy us. But I couldn't live in doubt anymore." Anais felt her heart fill with compassion. He had hidden so much from her, fought so many battles within himself to keep her from pain. She could understand his fear. Fear of losing her, of his feelings pushing her away. But she was here. She was by his side, despite all the dangers, despite all the darkness surrounding them. "You shouldn't have been afraid," she whispered, her hand gently brushing his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin. "I can't live without you, Reed. You've become a part of me, just as I've become a part of you. Nothing can change that." He closed his eyes, and her words seeped into his soul. He knew this love was not just attachment, not just chemistry. It was something more. It was their destiny, their fate. Reed opened his eyes and, looking at her with deep respect and gratitude, said, "You are my fate, and I'm not afraid of it anymore. I'm ready to be with you, ready to protect you. If this love is our path, then I will walk with you until the end." Anais smiled, her lips trembling with emotion, and she felt her soul fill with light. This was not the end of their journey. It was only its new chapter. And now that their bond was so strong, they could face any storm that lay ahead. Chapter 14. Dance Under the Moon. The dark forests wrapped around the land like ancient embraces, and only the moonlight paved its way through the tall trees, casting a silvery glow on the earth. Anais stood at the center of the clearing, her gaze fixed on the sky, where the full moon shimmered like a huge fire in the night. The moon was full of power, and its light seemed so bright that every sound and movement became sharper. She felt the power she had just begun to understand awakening inside her, growing and filling her. It was something more than just magic. It was her destiny. Reed stood beside her, his body tense, his gaze focused. He, like her, knew this night would change their lives. It was the moment they had to accept their roles, not only as a pair, but also as part of the pack, part of the forest, part of the great power that connected them. Everything around them seemed to freeze, as if nature itself was waiting for something important to happen, something that had to be etched into time. Anais turned to Reed, and in his gaze, she read everything that could not be said in words. He was ready, but she was ready too. He stepped forward, his muscles starting to change, slowly and steadily, until his body began to transform into a wolf. The wolf was enormous, its fur as black as the night, and its eyes shone with amber light. He was magnificent, and Anais couldn't take her eyes off him. He was not just her partner, but also an entity, part of the forest, part of something greater. The wolf lifted its head and howled in response to the moon, its voice, strong and mighty, echoed through the silent night. This howl was full of power and acknowledgement, as if nature itself was responding to his call. Anais felt something stir within her, and her heart beat faster. Everything that was happening at that moment felt as if it had been written by nature itself. Their bond was part of an ancient ritual, part of the universe. She took a step forward, her fingers barely brushing his dark fur. This was the moment when they were no longer just human and wolf, but something much greater. Her hand slid gently across his sides, and feeling her touch, Reed slightly lowered his head. His amber eyes met hers, and Anais understood. This was the moment when they became one. That moment when everything around them disappeared. Only the two of them, wolf and human. He was a part of her and she was a part of him. In their bond was something greater than just magic. It was their future. Anais, not taking her gaze off Reed, slowly began to move across the clearing, feeling how the forest filled with her presence, how every blade of grass and tree became part of her dance. She felt the power emanating from her, but also from Reed, from his wolf essence, from his bond with her, from their shared destiny. The wolf moved alongside her, step by step, like a partner in a ball, coordinated and harmonious. She and he were now inseparable. She felt how her own heart beat in sync with his steps. And this was not just a dance. It was their connection. It was the magic that made them move synchronously, not thinking about time, about the world around them. It was their night, a night under the full moon. They continued to dance in the shadow of ancient trees, feeling every moment, every touch, every glance. And in this dance, they became not just humans and animals. They became something greater, part of the pack, part of this world they protected and cherished. The wolf lifted its head again, and once more howled at the moon. His voice was full of strength, full of affirmation of their bond, full of love and protection. Anais joined him, and though her voice was not as powerful as his, she felt her soul fill with light as her heart responded to his call. And then, under that mighty howl, under the shining full moon, they realized that their bond was now unbreakable. Nothing and no one could separate them. This moment was theirs, a moment of eternity,